The US tax code is 4 million words long. Shakespeare's entire canon is just 900,000. Thankfully, most Americans just use the 1040 form, which is one of the simplest tax forms at just over 100 pages long if you include the instructions. Taxes are so confusing that when Money Magazine asked 50 professionals to come up with the same tax return for the same single family, they came up with 50 different answers. Seriously, is there anything worse than taxes? Well, yes, more taxes. Maybe we could be like ye old English folk who were taxed on windows, or like the Russians who were taxed on beards. Maybe we could be like the ancient Egyptians and get paid in beer, and taxed in beer. It depends on where you stand. Are you convinced that taxes are theft on successful people? You'd argue burdensome and convoluted tax laws fund wars and line the pockets of corrupt politicians. But maybe you're a realist, because countries can't be funded on bake sales. How else will we fund train lines, paved roads, and hospitals? However you fall on the question, the real debate is the motivation behind taxation. Are taxes a consequence of political expediency, social needs, or as arbitrary as the order of the alphabet? Chapter 1. Taxing Times and Tribal Tributes. The earliest known record of tax is 6000 BC. Clay tablets were found in modern-day Iraq. They record how the king of the city-state Lagash taxed different parts of the city each month to make it easier to count his beans. Literally, most tax was composed of food. Elsewhere in the likes of Babylon and Egypt, taxes were derived from property value. Not because a hovel was seen as the height of living, but because the land's production value was key for growing crops and raising livestock. You wouldn't pay in coin necessarily. Instead, you forfeited a portion of your annual harvest. But if you weren't a farmer, then you'd have to contribute your labor. This could be for menial infrastructure work or grand public projects, like the world's first pyramid scheme. You'd be paid in beer. However, the worst part were the taxes you'd pay once you were dead. Ancient Egyptians fully expected to pay taxes when they passed on to the afterlife, so found ways to game the system in what was arguably history's first tax avoidance scheme. Firstly, privileged Egyptians could send a substitute to perform their tax labor for them, so they extended this by including small figurines in their graves known as ushabti. These ushabti figurines were inscribed with spells to protect their masters from an eternity of tax. Think of it like ancient history's offshore bank accounts. As empires expanded, so did their cash flow. Conquered regions had to pay tax tributes to their new rulers. For some, using protection rackets to develop taxation policy is proof that average citizens were getting screwed from the start. But defenders will point out how military expansion helped transform public life. Funding aqueducts spearheaded sewer systems and hygiene. Public baths instilled wellness and leisure as a cultural norm, and the spread of the empire laid the groundwork for soldier pensions and retirement. Normalizing taxation also normalized tax rebates. That's good news for a slave owner, but still bad news for a slave. Conducting consensuses was tricky business, though. To ease the pain, taxes were based on entire communities rather than on individual homes. Provincial governments and local magistrates oversaw taxation, but the physical collection was auctioned off. The publicani were tax farmers who would outbid each other for the pleasure of being the most hated person on the planet, the taxman. If their bid won, then they paid the state the advance of the collection. These were effectively loans where Rome was expected to pay back any interest to the publicani. Tax collectors got to keep the interest plus anything in excess of their bid. However, they had to do the hard work of converting everything into coinage, and be prepared to make a loss if they weren't able to recoup their bid. To lower that risk, some Roman tax collectors colluded with local politicians to buy up large quantities of grain at low rates, which they could hold in reserve until they could mark up the value during a food shortage. But give it a few hundred years and citizens would push back against the taxman, which is why the policies for paying your dues got a whole lot stranger. So it's time to learn how history works as we count the ways taxes changed the world and understand why the history of tax is weird. We now turn your attention away from our scheduled programming to bring you a message from our sponsor, Compounded Daily. Friends, each week there's a bundle of riveting tales that regrettably can't make their debut here, all due to the whims of the YouTube algorithm. But fret not. By enlisting in my brand new and absolutely free email newsletter, you'll be in the know with stories like the intriguing inception of a VC fund by our allies at NATO. This newsletter, dear viewers, will traverse the exciting worlds of finance, business, and economics, ensuring you're always in the loop. If the topics discussed here pique your interest, then rest assured, You'll find the newsletter a delightful read. It's not only enjoyable, but also enlightening, offering you fresh insights from yours truly, a seasoned veteran in the investment banking world. Becoming a part of our newsletter family is as simple as 1, 2, 3, folks. Simply use the link provided in the description, make your way to compoundeddailycom, and then sign up with the email you use the most. Chapter 2. Medieval Money Matters. Once Europe's feudal system was in place, there was a whole new way to conduct society and taxes. Lords still taxed serfs according to their labor and produce like the good old days, except now a portion of a farmer's output paid rent rather than go directly to a centralized system. Not that it mattered. Whatever they handed to their lord was passed on to their boss. A lot of European royalty was funded solely off the backs of the peasantry. Good thing times have changed. Give or take a few countries and periods, nobles and their elites were exempt from tax. Good to know that some things never change. By crunching the numbers, we can see a typical medieval Swedish farmer could expect to pay 2% of his overall farm value, which was the equivalent of 32 grams of silver or up to 20 kilograms of churned butter. Whether it was European butter or Egyptian beer, the concept of tax had more or less stayed the same. But then, the tallage was introduced into England as a consequence of the successful Norman conquest of 1066. This system levied taxes on entire towns and the king's estates. Before, inhabitants paid a general tax that was applied broadly and regularly. Tallage was unpredictable and could be imposed by the monarch whenever the crown demanded it. That could be for military campaigns against surprise invaders or a birthday bash. Inconsistencies led to tension and discontent, which is why some wondered if it's why the folk hero legend Robin Hood resonated with so many people. Eventually, the common folk got sick and tired of the taxman coming to their door, so they did something about it. In 1215, barons raised their armies to confront King John. Economic hardships caused by military failures and heavy taxing weren't the only reasons that the king was forced to sign the Magna Carta, but they were a big part of it. If you read the fine print of one of the most significant legal documents in history, the very document that was a predecessor to the Declaration of Independence 500 years later, you will notice a clause addressing the imposition of taxes. It says in black and white that a ruler can't levy certain taxes without the consent of his subjects. This marked the first time in history when people had a say over the tax system that governed them. But this was only the beginning of the people's pushback. Over 150 years later, there was the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. It started when the Black Death wiped out a lot of the labor force. This gave the surviving workers more negotiating power with regards to working conditions and wages. Then there was the 100 Years' War, which had caused a lot of economic problems. Poll taxes hit the poorest of the poor the hardest. Yet, the straw that broke the camel's back was when a taxman wandered into town to collect the unpaid money. John Bampton was a royal official sent to Essex to collect what was owed, but instead, his arrival triggered a series of violent rebellions across the land. Luckily for him, he wasn't executed by the rebels until the 12th of June. By the 14th of June, 14-year-old King Richard II met with the rebels to discuss their demands. Demands included the abolition of serfdom and a promise of amnesty for all the fighting and killing they did. The king agreed. Then he went back on his word a few days later by killing the leaders of the uprising. Yet it didn't stamp out the flames of change. The concept of social inequality had spread, and the volatile nature of tax was understood. Over the next few hundred years, government officials and common folk alike were prepared to overhaul tax policies in their favor. Chapter 3. Revolutionary Revenue. Europe's transformation between the 14th and 17th centuries cannot be understated. It was a time of great art that produced talents like Da Vinci and Shakespeare. It was a time of great science that produced minds like Copernicus and Galileo. And it was also a time of nifty tax avoidance schemes that produced a lot of violence and death. Countries used this time to develop their concepts of rights and equality. This led to governments using tax and finance to spread social equality. The English government of 1696 tried to indirectly tax the wealthy through a fireplace tax. The more money you have, the bigger your home, and the more fireplaces you need to heat it. Pretty logical. But when that wasn't generating enough wealth, they introduced a window tax where your annual bill was effectively influenced by the amount of sunlight you received. The targets were estate owners, but everyone wanted to avoid the higher rates. Homeowners either bricked up their windows or built homes with none. That's why old buildings in London don't have windows. Of course, living in the dark makes it harder to see, and costs you more candles. But the lack of violent pushback meant that it was okay for people to find legitimate ways to save on their tax bill. However, another side effect was worse ventilation, especially in lower income areas. This led to health problems which incurred their own money problems. Russia's Peter the Great tried to improve public health by implementing a beard tax. Avoiding this surcharge was as simple as bathing and grooming. If you think such an obvious way to not stink doesn't need government intervention, then you've never been to a Smash Bros tournament. But soon, governments wouldn't have to rely on their citizens for funding. The Age of Discover opened new trade routes that far surpassed the offerings of the Silk Road. Import and export taxes were quickly established, with the most sought-after luxury goods being targeted for taxation. Obvious examples include silks and spices and precious metals, but exotic fruits also fetched a pretty penny. In our age of refrigeration and transportation, it's not that hard to get a hold of a pineapple. But to the people of the 1600s, displaying the exotic tropical delicacy at your dinner party was equivalent to parking your luxury supercar in a city where the speed limit is 30 miles per hour. A ripe one could set you back at least $5,000 in today's money. It was such a status symbol that some British manors had metal versions as busts on the gates. But all of this progressive taxation widened the wealth gap instead of spreading economic equality. Luxury goods became even more exclusive to the wealthy, and the public projects that were funded by taxes became fixtures of high society. Society and culture were growing at incredible speeds. Money was flowing everywhere. Tax was taken to the next level. Formal tax offices were set up. Administration was implemented. Bureaucracy was put in place to calculate finances to an astounding degree of accuracy. Governments now had more control over how their economies functioned and how their wealth was generated. Citizens had more autonomy with how they were taxed and more opportunities to better themselves. But it was only a matter of time until tax caused another conflict between countryman and country. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was a direct protest against the British government's harsh taxation of its colonies. Dumping tea into the Boston harbor set the America's War of Independence in motion. But it would be the French who showed the world how they really pushed back against a greedy government. Let's get one thing clear though. Marie Antoinette never said let them eat cake. Well, she probably never said it. But it doesn't matter. The sentiment sums up the French Revolution perfectly. A vastly inequitable tax system saw peasants starving in the street while the French royal family used tax money to renovate the wings and gardens of the Louvre Palace. France's bank account was also in the red for helping to fund America's fight against its British rulers. But we'll ignore that part for now. The point is, on the 14th of July, 1789, French citizens stormed the Bastille to free political prisoners, lighting the fuse for a new Europe. As the 19th century got underway, many would have believed tax had been figured out. Unfortunately, a renewed sense of individualism meant that the world had to prepare to deal with the worst thing ever created: income tax. Chapter 4. Taxing industry and taxing industry. Once the French monarchy had been removed and the American experiment had been established, Napoleon rose to power as a powerful new emperor. He went toe-to-toe with the Brits, so the English government sought to fund this new front line with a radical concept called income tax. Although some historians argue the Roman Emperor Augustus technically invented it, he abandoned the idea because the process was too difficult to execute. However, by the outbreak of the war in 1799, society and technology had progressed enough for states to track personal wealth. It was the first meaningful time in history that people's contribution to the funding of a state was proportional to the money in their account. Yet, the act was repealed at the end of the war. Support wasn't strong enough to justify working out the kinks. The crown couldn't risk another uprising so soon after taking care of their French rival. Thankfully, nations wouldn't have to wait long to discover a new way to make money. On the horizon was the Industrial Revolution. Cash flow made the trade routes of Columbus look like a yard sale. Soon, taxation would necessitate even more systemic and comprehensive policies to handle the diverse and growing sources of income. Economic conditions evolved to the point that a need for a reliable tax base was obvious to everyone, from the factory worker to the factory owner. So, the public accepted refined income systems. Around this time, employers started to accept their workers' demands for fair pay and fair working conditions. Once again, state and populace had a tug-of-war for the best of both worlds. Things didn't end perfectly for the little guy. Fat cats were still skimming off the top, but a new way of life was set in stone. Next came child labor laws in public schools, followed by improvements in medicine and public health care. Soon, leisure activities and the standards of living increased. Vacations weren't that unheard of. Consumer spending gave individuals power over the market and trends, and concepts like unemployment and retirement started to be formed. With all this progress stemming from income tax, it was no surprise that governments were looking for ways to generate more tax in a way that citizens liked. Take alcohol and tobacco. The recreation was enjoyed by the populace, which meant it could be taxed as a commodity. But also, there were health concerns, which meant governments could augment the tax to discourage people from consuming them. The money gained from someone drinking and smoking themselves to death could also be saved on the cost of unemployment, healthcare, and the justice system. It was a win-win. This paradox proved how tax could be leveraged for social engineering as much as nation building. However, the high excess taxes led to a proliferation of smuggling and black markets. Workers may have been happy with the improved public health, but criminal organizations became a new source of tension. If tax-paying citizens weren't having their goods stolen, they were having their services undercut, their unions hijacked, and their politicians bribed. Worse than that, they were about to pay more income tax. And before we forget, Al Capone wasn't busted on murder and racketeering, but for not paying his tax bill. But before that, the Great War had presented another temporary raise on income tax. But when the Great War became World War I and World War I led to World War II, it had become clear to everyone that income taxes were here to stay and their rates were always going to depend on who was in charge. The vast wars of the 20th century did lead to new tax systems, as you can't fund front lines on just one fixed revenue stream. By the time the mid-century hit, workers' rights and ideas of fairness had become so ingrained in society that they were seen as markers of a developed nation. Progressive tax structures distributed financial burdens more evenly across the population, and tax breaks and allowances incentivized businesses without punishing the poor. In theory, anyway. I'll leave the fighting over the fine print to the comment section. The point is, as the 21st century came into view, tax systems had become incredibly complex, but aided by sophisticated technology and radical new ideas about equality, fairness, and progress. It's normal now for different income levels to receive different income tax. Not paying tax is as much a criminal offense as it is a social faux pas. But there was one final devastating consequence of this new way of life. If there's a way to make money, then there's a way to make money by saving money. Not paying tax is big business. In fact, by 1913, income tax had been amended into the US Constitution. Until then, citizens were protected from their government garnishing their wages. In 1895, the US Supreme Court decided it was unconstitutional for the US government to levy taxes on wages, but that went out the window with the 16th Amendment. So what was the reason? Federal revenue, of course. Washington was relying primarily on tariffs and property taxes, but these options were limited and unpopular. Income tax was argued as a fairer way for everyone to pay their dues because it could be determined without using a state's population. Henceforth, a new legal foundation was created. And good timing too, because in a few short years, the Great War started, which presented another temporary increase to income tax. The likes of Apple, Amazon, and Starbucks are routinely criticized in the press for their quote-unquote technically legal but obviously immoral bookkeeping. Thankfully, people are fighting back. Politicians and activists work to close loopholes. Anti-money laundering task forces target tax-dodging giants. Citizens even make police reports if they know someone is screwing over everyone else. However, there's always going to be a fight over the definition of tax evading and tax avoidance. As cryptocurrency is slowly becoming a tool for bad actors to circumvent the government, the race is on for countries to streamline taxing digital currency. Some countries have already put some systems in place. But when the likes of Binance supposedly don't even have an HQ registered in any country, it makes it harder for the money to trickle down back to the people. On the other hand, some tout blockchain as the next revolution. They argue that it can spread equality and stability throughout civilization better than the traditional finance system. But what do you think? Is tax here to stay, or will the next step in civilization require a different way of thinking? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you like this video, make sure to watch our video on Al Capone to keep on learning how history works.